Heroes of Israel by William Garden Blaikie. Chapter 3. Entrance into Canaan, Shechem and Bethel. Genesis chapter 12, verses 6 to 9. The land in which Abram now became a sojourner differed widely from the where he had spent his youth, and from the Haran of his later years. Instead of an alluvial plain, it was a land of limestone mountains that broke up the surface into innumerable heights and hollows, and gave it, on the whole, a somewhat bare and rugged appearance. It has been remarked, and with considerable probability, that when Abram first saw the country, it had much the same appearance as it has today. In its more prosperous and settled days, the hills were terraced for vineyards and orchards. Fruit trees and other trees were abundant, and each homestead had a trig and comfortable aspect. Whereas now, as at first, the hills are bare, and fragments of rock and loose stones, strewed everywhere, give a neglected appearance to the whole. But the practised eye of Abram would readily perceive that, notwithstanding the unfavourable contrast with the level plains of the Euphrates and the Tigris, there were many parts of the country well adapted to the pasturing of flocks, while here and there, in the valleys between the mountains, there lay green plains of great beauty and fertility, adapted both for orchards and arable farms, so that it needed but care and labour to make it a most desirable and productive land. Approaching Canaan in a southwesterly direction from Damascus, the first object to attract his interest would be the grand chain of Lebanon, with its snow-clad ridges glittering in the light of the setting sun. Lebanon, with its two parallel ranges running north and south, and the valley between, was the northern boundary of the country, a highland rampart thrown up by nature to protect it on the quarter from which the most vigorous enemies commonly came. The days had not arrived when men admired mountains for their picturesqueness. There was no poetry in them then, but they were always esteemed as emblems of stability and as bulwarks of defence. The next general feature of the country to attract notice would be the valley of the Jordan. This river, while it forms the eastern boundary of Palestine proper, is the great drain of the country, both on the east and the west, carrying to the Dead Sea nearly all its superfluous water. It runs through a very singular valley, but if Abraham struck the valley far north, its peculiarity would not be observed at first. If he came upon it near the, quote, Sea of Merom, quote, or what is now the Lake Huleh, close to which he afterwards defeated the Confederate kings who had carried off Lot, he would find a fertile plain, in which the three branches of the Jordan unite, covered, if it was the season, with heavy crops of grain, and bright with a flora unlike that of Chaldea, in which special notice would be claimed by the fine Huleh lily, quote, the lily of the valleys, quote, and the lily of the Sermon on the Mount, raising its triple petals to form a gorgeous canopy, quote, such as art never approached, and king never sat under even in his utmost glory, Passing the waters of Merom, he would next skirt the Lake of Galilee, reposing amid its calm surrounding hills, but showing a depression, though Abraham would not be aware of this, of above 600 feet below the level of the Mediterranean. But as he followed the windings of the river southward, he must have had his attention turned to the gradual deepening of the valley in which it flows, now ascertained to be so great that where the Jordan enters the Dead Sea it is 1,300 feet below the level of the Mediterranean. He would perceive what a valuable protection that deep valley afforded to the country on the west, the more especially that the mountains on either side rose up to a considerable height, forming an elevated plateau of irregular surface, broken up by lateral ridges and valleys running down into the valley below. When Abram became better acquainted with the country, he would see what an important feature this elevated plateau formed. It constituted a kind of backbone or dorsal ridge, admirably adapted for the sites of cities, and forming the key to the dominion of the country. Further observation would reveal the low and fertile plain which ran on the west between the base of the plateau and the Mediterranean, which might well be called the, quote, Great Sea, end quote, in comparison with the Persian Gulf, the only piece of salt water that Abram had hitherto known. When he afterwards followed the Jordan to the Vale of Siddim, he would observe the splendid capabilities of that part of the valley, where the leafy palm, thick spread and luxurious, revealed a climate equal to that of more southerly lands. And when he surveyed the country at leisure, he would see that its hilly terraces were equally adapted for the culture of the vine, its valleys for wheat and other grain crops, and its breezy, hilly ranges for the pasture of flocks and herds. Small though it was, insignificant though the Jordan was compared with the Euphrates, and contracted though the valleys were compared with the vast plain of the Chaldean rivers, it was a compact, an interesting, a promising country, capable of rearing a remarkable population, with more active habits and a more enterprising character than the monotonous fertility of Chaldea was likely to produce. We may believe that one of Abram's first employments after setting foot in the land was to turn over in his mind the promise that had been given to him in Ur, and to think what it meant. Quote, I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. End quote. To make of him a great nation was not necessarily a desirable thing, for a great nation, fired by mad ambition, would be a source of much mischief and misery. But when the promise was attended with such explicit assurance of the divine blessing, it gave truly a magnificent prospect. And not only was God to be favourable to him and his seed, but he was to count Abram's friends as his friends, and Abram's enemies as his enemies, the greatest proof of friendship which kings in their treaties ever give to one another. Nor was Abram to be a mere recipient of good things. He was to exemplify the divine saying, quote, It is more blessed to give than to receive, end quote. Quote, Thou shalt be a blessing, end quote. He was to be a channel of benediction to others. Quote, When the eye saw him, it would bless him, and when the ear heard him, it would bear witness to him. The blessing of him that was ready to perish would come upon him, and he would cause the widow's heart to leap for joy. End quote. And not only was he to be a channel of blessing, but, in his seed, a source of it. Quote, In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. End quote. We know how to interpret these words from the commentary of St. Paul in the New Testament, Galatians chapter 3, verses 8, Galatians chapter 3, verses 8 and 16. But how did they appear to Abram? Our Lord helps us to answer. Quote, Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. End quote. John chapter 8, verse 56. There can be no reasonable doubt that Abram attached a messianic meaning to the words. The messianic tradition of paradise and later revelations had not yet died out, and this promise was evidently an expansion of it. To one like Abram, it was most suggestive and full of glory, though it may have been a vague glory, more like the glory of an autumn sunset than the clear and clean-cut landscape of a winter morning. It affords the key at once to his readiness to leave the land of his fathers and come to this distant Canaan, and to the immovable steadfastness with which he and his sons clung to the country, save only when inexorable hunger compelled them to go elsewhere for a time for bread. The inalienable attachment of the patriarchs to the land of Canaan is a fact of history that defies any reasonable explanation, except that it was founded on the messianic hope. We shall see that when famine drives Abram to Egypt, the king loads him with wealth and honour, but forthwith he returns to Canaan. A burial place has to be provided for Sarah, but he does not think of laying her remains in the sepulchre of her fathers. He purchases a field and a cave from the sons of Heth. A wife has to be found for Isaac, and his confidential servant is sent to Padan Aram, the residence of his brother Nahor. His servant foresees that even if he finds a suitable maiden, her family will be very unwilling to send her to Canaan, and may propose that Isaac should go to her, not she to Isaac. Abram deprecates the thought. It is not to be entertained for a moment. If the damsel will not come to Canaan, the matter must end. Jacob quarrels with Esau and flies to Laban. He marries his daughters and prospers in his employment, and everything, save Laban's temper, seems to point to his settling in some part of that country. The anger of Esau is a real and very terrible source of alarm, but, in spite of all, Jacob dares every risk and ventures back to Canaan, because it is the land of promise and of blessing. When Jacob hears of Joseph being ruler in Egypt, he cannot comfortably consent to leave Canaan and go down to him till he has got the divine permission. On the death of Jacob, his body is carried by his sons to be buried at Machpelah, in the sepulchre of his fathers. And when Joseph is dying, he takes an oath of his brethren that when God visits them, they will carry up his bones to Canaan. Centuries of bondage pass in Egypt, but the one consideration that rouses the people to attempt to escape from captivity is that a blessed future has been promised them in that land. And hurried though their departure is, they do not forget to carry the bones of Joseph with them. No explanation of such transactions can stand for a moment that does not proceed from the ground that it was a divine communication that first drew Abram to Canaan, and that held the hearts of his descendants for centuries by its wondrous spell, and that the preeminent glory of that message was that in his divine descendant all families of the earth were to be blessed. When Abram came to Canaan, he did not find it an Australia or a Manitoba, comparatively empty of inhabitants and only waiting to be occupied. It was already in possession of others. But it does not seem to have been densely peopled. There was but a sprinkling of inhabitants, and these did not hold so tenaciously to their rights as to prevent a stranger, where there was room for him, from at least pasturing his flocks among them. This, however, was the full extent of a stranger's privilege. There was a strict land tenure as regarded possession, so that when Abraham, after a long residence, desired to procure a burying place for his dead, he could not acquire a right to it without going through an elaborate form of conveyancing, and publicly paying the stipulated price to its acknowledged owners. The inhabitants of Canaan in Abram's time are variously designated in Scripture. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 6, chapter 24, verse 37, etc., they are simply, quote, the Canaanites, end quote. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, they are, quote, the Amorites, end quote. In Genesis chapter 15, verses 19 and 21, 10 nations are enumerated, quote, the Kenites, and the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Rephaims, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites, end quote. More frequently, 6 nations are enumerated: the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Exodus chapter 3, verses 8 and 17, chapter 23, verse 23, chapter 33, verse 2, chapter 34, verse 2, Joshua chapter 12, verse 8. Once the Perizzites are omitted, making the number 5, Exodus chapter 13, verse 5, and once the Perizzites and the Hittites, reducing it to 4, Numbers chapter 13, verse 29. On the other hand, in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1, the Girgashites are added to the 6, and the whole are described as, quote, 7 nations, greater and mightier than thou, end quote. Other variations in the enumeration are also found. The natural explanation is that those whose names occur most frequently were the most conspicuous and powerful, while the others held a subordinate position. On this principle, we conclude that the most powerful were the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites. Let us endeavour to state what ancient records and modern research have to tell us concerning these. Of the Canaanites proper, we are told that they dwelt, quote, by the sea and by the coast of Jordan, end quote. Numbers chapter 13, verse 29. The term Canaan is derived from a root which signifies to be low, and is thus appropriate to the 2 regions specified in this passage. The Shephelah, or maritime plain of the Philistine and Phoenician coast, and the Arabah or plain of the Jordan. But there is another and perhaps more natural derivation of the term, from Canaan, the son of Ham, for, quote, Canaan begat Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite, and the Hivite, end quote. Genesis chapter 10, verses 15 to 17. We may thus see how the inhabitants as a whole were called Canaanites. But when more specific designations are employed, the term was restricted to the inhabitants of the low tracts. And this restriction appears in the New Testament. The woman from the coasts of Tyre and Sidon, whose daughter our Lord healed, being called, quote, a woman of Canaan, end quote. Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 and 22. The Amorites, quote, dwelt in the mountains, end quote. Numbers chapter 13, verse 29. The Hebrew name denoting an elevated place, the opposite of, quote, Canaan, end quote. They were a particularly powerful and warlike people. They took a conspicuous part in wars with earlier inhabitants, especially in Bashan and Gilead. For in the time of Moses, two very powerful Amorite kingdoms, those of Sihon and Og, had been established there by the power of the sword, and the name of the people had become proverbial. Numbers chapter 21, verses 27 to 30. The Hittites and the Jebusites were also highlanders, at least in their earliest settlements, Numbers chapter 13, verse 29. The Jebusites being a powerful people in the south, whose great fortress, Jebus, afterwards Jerusalem, defied all the efforts of the Israelites to take it, until at last it yielded to the prowess and skill of David. From the earlier references to the Hittites, one would hardly suppose that they differed much from the other tribes. It is only when we come to Joshua that we learn that, quote, the land of the Hittites, end quote, embraced the whole tract, quote, from the wilderness and Lebanon unto the great river, the river Euphrates, and unto the great sea toward the going down of the sun, end quote. Chapter 1, verse 4. It used to be alleged that Bible history had here introduced a great empire of which ancient history knew nothing. But of late years it has been made plain from Egyptian, Assyrian, and Hittite monuments likewise that the references of Scripture are literally correct. Before proceeding to state what we have recently learned respecting the Hittites, it is necessary to point out that in the Bible the names of the various tribes are not applied in a precise manner. They are indeed often used interchangeably. Thus, the city of Hebron is at one time connected with Amorites. Compare Genesis chapter 13, verse 18, chapter 14, verse 13, Joshua chapter 10, verse 5. At another with Hittites, Genesis chapter 23, and at another with Canaanites, Judges chapter 1, verse 10. Jerusalem is Amorite in Joshua chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, but Jebusite in Judges chapter 1, verse 21, and 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6, etc. The Canaanites of Numbers chapter 14, verse 45, are Amorites in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 44. It is evident that the line of demarcation between the tribes was anything but precise. Evidently, they did not preserve carefully their distinctions of race, but mixed freely with one another. Few results of recent archaeological research are more interesting than the light thrown on the empire of the Hittites as it existed in early times. It is as if another Pompeii had been disinterred. The discovery is even more striking than the revelations we have had of Assyria and Egypt, because from of old we have known that there were great empires, but it was hardly surmised that the Hittites were more than a Canaanite tribe. The fullest account of this people, and of the steps by which they have become known, is to be found in the work of Dr. Wright. His conclusions as to the Hittite inscriptions were at first disputed, but are now more generally accepted. In Brooks' work on Egypt, and other books on the monuments, much information on the history of this people will be found. Our information regarding the Hittites is derived from certain inscriptions in Hittite character which have been found in Hama, Aleppo, Carchemish, etc., as deciphered by Professor Sayce, but more fully from Egyptian and Assyrian monuments. Very early Egyptian records refer emphatically to certain enemies across the northeast frontier of Egypt, under the name Amu, herdsman. And of these, two are very prominent: the Akharu, or Phoenicians, and the Khita, or Keta, the Kati of the Assyrian monuments, or Hittites of Scripture. The monuments give us reason to believe that the empire of the Khita, or Hittites, existed before that of Assyria, and that before Abraham's time it dominated northern Syria, extending over the whole region which, as we have just seen, is assigned to it by Joshua. Its two principal cities were Kadesh on the Orontes and Carchemish on the upper Euphrates. It became so strong a power that it was a formidable rival to Egypt. We find notices of great battles between the two powers in the territories of both. Thutmose III, the Egyptian Alexander, a little later than the time of Abraham, conducted a great campaign against these Khita in the region of Mesopotamia. Ramesses II also signalized himself by his wars with them, and, while victorious, paid a compliment to their greatness and their prowess by marrying a daughter of the Khita king. Palestine lay out of the way of both the Hittite capitals, Kadesh and Carchemish, and the Hittites residing in it do not seem to have differed much from the other tribes. The resident tribes of Canaan appear to have been under local sheikhs or kings, who ruled over their own little territories, but combined together on extraordinary occasions. In Abram's time, they did not appear to have been quarrelsome or troublesome to strangers. But Abram was at great pains to avoid all that might excite their opposition or suspicion. His part was a difficult one. He was really an intruder among them, and it is a wonder that they never rose against him or tried to drive him out. He must have borne himself towards them with extraordinary patience and tact. He always impresses us as a man of remarkable self-control and wise, careful demeanour. But for this, he would have been liable to constant squabbles with the original inhabitants. Towards them he no doubt exercised the same peace-loving spirit as he showed when strife arose between his herdsmen and Lot's, often giving up his rights, though not probably in the too-yielding spirit which was characteristic of Isaac. Genesis chapter 26, verses 17 to 22. The religion of the Canaanites was of a corrupt type. In its leading features, it resembled the Chaldean, from which it originally came. The leading principle was personification of the powers of nature, as if every object or phenomenon in nature possessed a spirit, either benevolent or malevolent. As the sun is by far the most glorious object in nature, so the worship of Baal, the sun god, was the leading feature of the religion. Whatever calamity befell the people, it was ascribed to the displeasure of Baal. It became necessary to propitiate him by appropriate rites. The sun god demanded a sacrifice by fire. Children were burned alive, garlanded with flowers, amid music and other signs of joy. With Baal was associated Ashtoreth, the goddess of the moon. By some means not easily explained, she was connected, too, with the planet Venus, and became the Astarte of the Philistines and the Aphrodite of the Greeks. In connection with her worship, the vilest sensuality was sanctified, and an unbounded pollution of morals ensued. When religion thus became the patron of all grossness, the very foundations of society were destroyed. Innumerable other gods were worshipped by the Canaanites. Abram and his company seem to have faithfully resisted all compliance with these practices, but in after times the Canaanitish idolatry proved a fatal snare to Israel. It is said that after arriving in Canaan, Abram, quote, passed through the land unto the place of Sychem, unto the plain of Moreh, end quote. Sychem is the Shechem of later times. Abram would reach it by passing down on one side of the Jordan, as we have supposed, and when about midway between the Lake of Galilee and the Dead Sea, striking westwards or southwestwards till he reached the valley of Shechem. This vale has usually been the theme of special admiration by travellers in Palestine. Quote, I was ravished, end quote, says Van der Velde, quote, with the beauty and loveliness that here surrounded me on all sides. Nothing that I had seen yet in Palestine appeared to me so charming as that dale. Here there is no wilderness, here there are no wild thickets, yet there is always verdure, always shade, not of the oak, the terebinth, the garub tree, but of the olive grove, so soft in colour, so picturesque in form, that for its sake we can willingly dispense with all other wood. Here there are no impetuous mountain torrents, yet there is water, too, in more copious supplies than anywhere else in the land, and it is just to its many fountains, rills, and watercourses that the valley owes its exquisite beauty. If somewhere in the neighbourhood of Shechem the oak grove of Moreh stood, it is no wonder that Abraham, on seeing the place, thought it good and inviting for pitching his tent. The valley is far from broad, not exceeding in some places a few 100 feet. End quote. In approaching Shechem, quote, for the last quarter of an hour you pass through fruit gardens. Here there are walnut, mulberry, apricot, almond, fig, and pomegranate trees, among the branches of which clusters of grapes hang down in wreaths and festoons. Brooks gurgle through these orchards from all sides, and those hills to the right and left of the valley that raise their highest summits around the town, what are they? They are Ebal and Gerizim, the mountains from which Israel's curses and blessings were pronounced. End quote. Stanley's description of the valley is not quite as glowing, but has an interest of its own. Quote, the traveller descends into a wide plain, the wildest and most beautiful of the plains of the Ephraimite mountains, one mass of corn, unbroken by boundary or hedge, from the midst of which start up olive trees, themselves unenclosed in the fields in which they stand. Over the hills which close the northern end of this plain, far away in the distance, is caught the first glimpse of the snowy ridge of Hermon. Its western side is bounded by the abutments of two mountain ranges, running from west to east. These ranges are Gerizim and Ebal, and up the opening between them, not seen from the plain, lies the modern town of Nablus. This is one of the few instances in which the Roman, or rather the Greek name, has superseded in popular language the ancient Semitic appellation, Nablus being the corruption of Neapolis, the, quote, new town, founded by Vespasian after the ruin of the older Shechem, which probably lay further eastward, and therefore nearer the opening of the valley. A valley green with grass, grey with olives, gardens sloping down on each side, fresh springs rushing down in all directions. At the end, a white town embossomed in all this verdure, lodged between the two high mountains which extend on each side of the valley. That on the south, Gerizim, that on the north, Ebal. This is the aspect of Nablus, the most beautiful, perhaps it might be said, the only very beautiful spot in central Palestine. End quote. We all know how our permanent feelings about a place are influenced by first impressions, especially favourable impressions. God seems on purpose to have guided Abram to this select spot, in order that his face might be the more radiant and his heart the more thrilled as he listened to the promise, quote, unto thy seed will I give this land. End quote. We are told that Abram had his place under the oak or terebinth of Moreh, see Revised Version. In Authorized Version, quote, the plain of Moreh, end quote. Few will agree with Van der Velde that where we have the olive, we do not miss the oak. The oak has now disappeared from Shechem, but in Abram's time it was one of those conspicuous trees that marked out a neighbourhood. There seems to have been no, quote, white town embossomed in the verdure, end quote, in those days at the end of the vista between the two mountains. The oak or terebinth was the monument of the place, and standing with its guarded trunk behind him and its spreading branches above, Abram might find a symbol of the promise very helpful to his faith. Old and hard though the trunk of the tree was, it could yet send out young sprigs of vegetation, and so might he and Sarai yet have seed. And these vigorous branches that spread out so far in every direction, might not his posterity one day resemble them, and cover the whole land on whose soil he now stood? Happy posterity, if it should be their lot to dwell peacefully in this peaceful valley. In the contemplation of that prospect, the toils and troubles of the journey from Haran to Shechem would be forgotten, and the heart of Abram would seek an outlet for the grateful feeling that welled up to his God. At that outlet he found, quote, There he builded an altar to the Lord that appeared to him." End quote. Under that oak, many idolatrous rites had probably been performed of old. It was now to be dedicated to a higher worship. A pillar might have been a suitable record of his gratitude, but something more sacred than a pillar was called for. An altar was a symbol of sacrifice, a place on which to present an offering. The fact of its being a simple altar in the open air was a testimony to the simplicity and spirituality of Abram's religion. No temple was necessary, and no image was lawful. A plain altar was all. In every true heart, signal mercy rouses the sense of signal unworthiness. It brings sin to remembrance, and quickens the desire for a sinless condition. Abram's altar served many purposes. It was a testimony for the people of the land to that one living and true God whom Abram served. It was a memorial of his gratitude for his wonderful mercy, and it was a token of trust in forgiving and redeeming grace through sacrificial propitiation, and of longing for that purity of heart which would err from God's ways no longer, but obey and love him evermore. But it seems to have been little more than a glimpse of Shechem that Abram got now. It was too choice a spot to be at his disposal. The Canaanite was then in the land, and he knew the value of land too well to leave Shechem to adventurers. So Abram, quote, removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. End quote. The spot is described with great minuteness, and the identification of it has been easily accomplished. Quote, immediately east of the low grey hills, end quote, says Stanley, on which the Canaanitish Luz and the Jewish Bethel afterwards stood, and where, we may add, the 3 or 4 acres of ruinous Beatin are today, rises, as the highest of a succession of eminences now marked by some vestige of ancient edifices. A conspicuous hill, its topmost summit resting, as it were, on the rocky slopes below, and distinguished from them by the olive grove which clusters over its broad surface above. End quote. Here was the first spot in Canaan where it is expressly said that Abram pitched his tent. This seems to confirm our view that it was but a flying visit he paid to Shechem. The high ground, says Robinson, quote, is one of the finest tracts for pasturage in the whole land, end quote. Here, probably, he might remain unmolested for a time, till his large flocks had consumed all the available nourishment, and it was necessary to hie him to, quote, fresh woods and pastures new, end quote. And here, too, quote, he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord, end quote. For he was neither forgetful of his God, nor ashamed of his religion. The words describing his worship are simple but expressive. There is an infinite difference between the religion that is satisfied with the outward form and that of the heart which is so full of God that the form is but the drapery of the devotion that breathes within. If he did not make it his business to convert the natives of the country to his faith, neither did he conceal his religion from them. His altar stood before their eyes, and they might readily see the kind of service which he rendered. And if they asked him aught concerning his religion, he would doubtless tell them of his own early idolatries, and of the struggle through which he had renounced Baal and Ashtoreth. And he would let them know how much happier and more satisfied he was now, worshipping him who made earth and sun and stars alike, who had revealed himself to him as his friend and father, and had given him a promise that in his seed all the families of the earth would be blessed. But even Bethel could not supply permanently what was needful for his flocks, and, quote, Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south, end quote. The southern road from Bethel would lead him through many places afterwards to become famous in the history of his race. First Ramah, then Gibeah, then Jerusalem, then Bethlehem, and then Hebron and Beersheba. There is no reason to suppose that any one of these places would attract his special attention, except, perhaps, that he might be struck with the grand situation of Jerusalem, and think how, as the mountains were round about it, so the Lord was round about his people. Possibly he met with Melchizedek as he passed his capital. On the whole, it is best for us all that the future of ourselves and our families is concealed from our view. And it was well for Abram, as he passed Mount Moriah, whether that was Mount Gerizim, near Shechem, or the mount beside the fortress of the Jebusites, that he had no foreboding of what was afterwards to be enacted there. But now a new and terrible experience befell him. Quote, "There was a famine in the land." End quote. It is easy to conjure up the horrors that must have resulted to an establishment so large as Abram's, where both men and children and cattle required to be fed, and food was not to be found. Quote, "He has to look on his herd melting away, his favourite cattle losing their appearance, his servants murmuring and obliged to scatter. And in his dreams he must have, night after night, seen the old country, the green breadth of the land that Euphrates watered, the heavy-headed corn bending before the warm airs of his native land. But morning by morning he wakes to the same anxieties, to the sad reality of parched and burned-up pastures, shepherds hanging about with gloomy looks, his own heart distressed and failing." End quote. It is not difficult to conceive the sore trial to Abram's faith. The situation was somewhat similar to that of the Israelites in the desert of Sinai when they murmured against Moses and charged him with bringing the host into the wilderness to kill them with hunger. But whatever fears and misgivings may have occasionally stolen into his heart, Abram appears to have maintained his calmness and thought deliberately and carefully what was best to be done. Whether or not he came to his conclusion in the spirit of pure regard to the will of God, we are not told, but his resolution was to go down to Egypt. It was the granary of the world, and bread was to be found there when it could not be got anywhere else. Besides, it had numberless other attractions to a man like Abram. Now that he was in the south of Canaan, he was near Egypt. He would stay only for a little time, and return at the earliest possible moment. This seemed the only solution of the difficulty. His tents are struck, his camels are loaded, his flocks collected, and such stores for the journey as he could obtain are provided. And by the same route, probably, as his great-grandchildren in the days of Jacob, he directs his steps to the land of the Nile.